businesses will often say is that one of the keys to success is not to understand success itself, but to understand failures, how failures occur, and how exactly they unfold. And the key to understanding failures is to understand the various assumptions that are often made. There are always assumptions that are going on in our own personal lives, assumptions that we make, but also assumptions that we make or others make in the business world, in other types of work. Um, a lot of times, the failures that we see in workplaces happen because we or others assume that someone checked something that was supposed to be checked for safety reasons. Or even at home, you might assume that you turned off the stove, and then the thought suddenly occurs to you, oh, maybe I didn't turn it off. So a lot of times we assume correctly. We assume things are working the way that they should. We assume that the world works the way we think it should work. We make assumptions as a way of taking a kind of a shortcut mentally. We have experience with certain things, and thus we assume, or we make assumptions that things will work the same way in the future, that they'll continue working the way that they've always worked. And we base those assumptions sometimes on faulty information. A lot of those assumptions throughout history, in whether it's the business world or in the political world or in militaristic world, sometimes those assumptions can lead to colossal failures. We know that in modern history, in the financial world, in 2007, 2008, there were big failures like the Lehman Brothers. Assumptions are sometimes made in the financial world where they assume that things like bonds will stay the same price, that there's stability there, or in stock prices. Same thing in 2022 or 2023 with Silicon Valley Bank, or in the early 2000s with companies like Enron. There are certain assumptions that people make that others are doing things in the correct way, that shortcuts aren't being taken, that people are doing the right thing. Also, in the ancient world, there's various assumptions that are made about the enemy. There's a lot of times in world history there have been colossal upsets, as in what happened with the Persians and the Greeks. We know the Battle of Thermopylae or Salamis. Those were key points when the Persians underestimated their Greek adversaries, and due to various conditions like the weather or the underestimating the skill of their opponents, those key defeats led to an entire shift in the way that the world power was structured, and so that the power that was centered in the eastern part of the world shifted over to the western part of the world, at least relative to the Middle East or the Near East. And so even also in the modern world, in recent, or relatively speaking, in the past 100 years, you've had upsets, with the Vietnam War or the Soviet-Afghan War, or further back in medieval history, you have the Battle of Agincourt, where the British were able to defeat the French. And so there's many more you could go into throughout the world history where assumptions were made about the enemy or about the situation, and those assumptions turned out to be wrong. And in biblical history, one of the kind of like key examples of assumptions that were made that turned out to be wrong was in the famous battle of David and Goliath. In fact, even in the secular world, you can scarcely go a year without hearing somebody make that kind of metaphor or use it as an example, talking about David versus Goliath. Whether it's modern conflicts or in the business world or even just casually, people will say, in like talking about sports, it's a, real David versus Goliath in terms of talking about upsets. And even though, there's a lot to be learned about that story from the kind of like the actual battle of David versus Goliath, I'm also kind of more interested in looking at this morning the all the assumptions that were made by everyone else in that, including also Goliath, but not really focusing on just David himself. A lot of times with Bible stories, it's some of these stories, especially the ones we learn as children, or ones that are just commonly preached about. There's a lot of these details that people get into to try and make the story more exciting, and it is exciting. It's as with, I'm sure, a lot of us, it was my favorite story as a child, the story of David versus Goliath, because it has all the elements of a great story, right? It's, first of all, it's the underdog story, which we love as humans. This is why a lot of us love sports, or just any type of storytelling, really, any type of narrative driven story that involves someone who is less powerful being able to defeat someone who's more powerful, or even just talking about not necessarily just individuals, but forces, nations. Well, we all love an underdog story, and always when they talk about the story of David versus Goliath, they can focus on different things. They'll focus on the aspects of the sling itself. How you could a well-trained slinger could basically get a stone to go as fast as a Major League Baseball pitcher or whatever, going 90, 100 miles per hour. They like to talk about the exact type of armor that Goliath was wearing, or the different things involved in the story itself, all the little details. And a lot of that, thankfully is familiar to us, so I don't have to spend a lot of time going into the details of the David versus Goliath. But I do want to get into looking at all the various assumptions involved, and looking at it as a failure analysis, looking at the various incorrect assumptions that were made, led to really Goliath being defeated, but also just understanding all the other failures that were involved that could have hindered the success. But this is really why it's a story about God rather than just being a story about David. Obviously, David is involved. David is the key figure here. But it's really about God not being limited by the assumptions and the failures of man. So there's really 4 different spheres of failure, or 4 different spheres of incorrect assumptions that were being made in this story of David versus Goliath. And the passage we're looking at is 1 Samuel chapter 17. We're almost entirely going to be looking at this chapter, but I'll also bring up the previous chapter just to refer back to something. But 1 Samuel chapter 17. And what we see there's 4 spheres of failure, 4 spheres of incorrect assumptions that were being made. Firstly, the assumptions that were made within David's own family. Secondly, the failures or the assumptions were made at the government or military level, and also just by way of minor reflection, also looking at the spiritual level too, looking at Samuel, but that's more of a minor reflection of the government as a whole. Thirdly, looking at the assumptions, the incorrect assumptions made by the people as a whole. And then lastly, looking at the assumptions made by the Philistines, who are also a proxy for the rest of the world. So firstly, looking at David's family. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to read many of these verses. I'll just I'll reference them, but we're not going to read them. And these are all familiar to us, and you can also just note these down for later reference if you want to go back to it. But in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 25 through 28, what we see there is we see that David this is when David is really entering the scene. We know that the scene is in chapter 17. This is already the stage is already set at the beginning of the chapter for the battle. This is earlier in the chapter we see that the challenge is occurring. This has been going on for some days, where the Philistines and the Israelites are gathered on opposite sides, and they're really on opposite sides and not really engaging in active battle, largely because they would have been either evenly matched or fairly evenly matched, force versus force, or enough so that both sides were worried about incurring heavy losses. And so this is why we see the very familiar situation that Goliath is coming, and presenting day after day this challenge, acting as a champion on his side of the Philistines, and asking or confronting the Israelites on the opposite side, telling them, to put up their own challenger to fight them. And so he was. This was not unheard of for ancient times to kind of challenge the opposite side to a battle of champions in one-on-one combat in order to act as proxies. In the modern day, we don't do this as much, although you kind of see hints of it, kind of like, between India and Pakistan, or India and China, on opposite sides of the border. Sometimes they'll engage in, I wouldn't say friendly necessarily, but they engage within kind of these proxy, dances, I guess you could call them, or challenges, or staring down each other. Sometimes, it turns into literal stick fighting, but it's rather than actually actively engaging, shooting each other, they engage in these kind of like proxy conflicts. And also, we have in the modern world, even in the West, friendly rivalries. We use sports as a way of having, rather than engaging in conflict, it's just a friendly way of challenging other states or other institutions. And countries too. The Olympics exist as a way of friendly competition rather than engaging in conflict in total. But what we see here in the ancient world is that this is not friendly, obviously, but this is a kind of a way for them to engage in full conflict, full battle, because both sides are probably concerned about incurring heavy losses, if not outright losing to the other. And so this challenge goes out, and in verses 25 through 28, this is when David arrives on the scene, and he's asking why nobody's going to challenge this Philistine. Why are the people afraid of challenging him? And what we see is the first incorrect assumption that we're looking at is the incorrect assumption that David's own family makes, and this is we see elsewhere also that the rest of his family also kind of shared this assumption about David as the youngest. But in verse 28, it says there, "Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, 'Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle.'" So there's kind of an ironic thing there that David's brother, this is his older brother, the eldest brother. This is the same one whom Samuel incorrectly kind of assumed in the prior chapter when David was anointed. God had sent him there, and he saw all the other brothers first, David's eldest brothers, and he assumed God had sent him there to pick, the kind of obvious choice to him, was the tall one, the oldest brother. He looked like probably that he would be a good king, kind of like Saul looked to the people as to be a good candidate because he was tall. He had all the characteristics that he was looking for in a leader. And so Eliab, it's kind of funny because he says, "I know your presumption and the evil of your heart." Well, he's assuming David's intention there. Incorrectly, he's assuming David's intention there. And meanwhile, it's his own, he's saying that, that David is the one who is looking for entertainment or just to see the battle that's going on. And he's projecting probably what his own reasoning would be. This is his own, thinking. and that's that's not the reason why he had come down there. And Eliab doesn't really understand the situation, and we see this, even though David has already been anointed in the prior chapter, even though David has already made contact with Saul, even though David has already been acknowledged as somebody who has potential. He's a musician, talented musician. He's already acknowledged to be familiar with war, at least in a novice sense. It doesn't say that he's experienced. In fact, it's the opposite. But this assumption that his own family makes against him, to the point where it says even that Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And so rather than being open to David, showing up, and keep in mind, Eliab has done nothing. Eliab has, even though he's apparently the one who looks to be the qualified one to engage with battle, he's too scared too. And so does he really have any right to be angry or to make this kind of assumption? And the answer is no. He has no right to be making that type of assumption about the motivations of someone else, especially as he himself is maybe not a coward, but in face of this Goliath, yes, he is afraid, and so he really shouldn't be assuming anything about his brother. So that's the first assumption that's incorrect, is from David's own family. And also in the prior chapter, they all dismissed David as kind of being the one that Samuel was to be looking for to anoint. They all just assumed it must have been one of the elder brothers, one of the ones who are more qualified or more experienced and all these things. And no, that wasn't to be the case. And so that's David's own family making the incorrect assumption. Secondly, we see the incorrect assumptions made by the government or the military, and this includes King Saul himself. So in 1 Samuel chapter 17, the same chapter, in verses 31 through 33, it says there, "When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, 'Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine.' And Saul said to David, 'You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth.'" So right there we see not only David's own family, but these strangers or relative strangers are making assumptions about him. King Saul is he's saying there, what would be he's saying what would be to us a kind of a very rational kind of assumption, right? If in this day and age, we might not be looking at somebody in terms of their experience in terms of warfare, unless we're in the army or some other armed force. We might not be looking at that, but we might be looking at someone's resume. We might be looking at or listening to them in an interview, and we ask for their experience, and they say, "Oh, I basically have no experience," or you look at the resume and there's nothing on there. We would laugh at somebody if they were applying to a high level position or in the armed services experience, world, if they tried to volunteer for a mission that would require a lot of experience. That somebody, a type of mission that would normally take someone who's a specialist, special forces, right? So we often dismiss that kind of thing, and so we can't really blame Saul too much for saying, you're just a youth. You're just, he's David's a teenager. He's the youngest of all the kids, even within his own family. He doesn't have an extensive record or whatever. Yes, he seems to be knowledgeable or capable, like in the same way that an intern, a well-qualified intern might be, that, or not even well-qualified, but somebody who seems to, have some sense. But you wouldn't send a complete novice like that, against literally a 9'9" giant on their first go, especially. This is nobody. This is King Saul, who is himself a capable warrior, but then he's at his command. He's got all these other capable warriors, people who have a lot more experience under the belt. So it's reasonable from a human perspective to say, you know, you shouldn't be going out there, David. You're just a kid. And this giant, aside from being a giant, this guy has been fighting his entire life. He's a warrior of the Philistines. I'm sure, you know, he was probably like, you know, 6 foot tall, 7 foot tall, even when he was like 10 years old. So I'm sure they immediately decided to make him a warrior and train him, you know, because it was pretty obvious that this guy was going to be physically capable and imposing. And so Saul makes that assumption. He assumes that the experience of David, or the lack thereof, mattered more than what God's will was. Even though up until this point, Saul, in the prior chapters, it says that the Spirit of God left Saul. So the Spirit of God was no longer with him, and in fact, he's now has demonic forces acting on him, which is why he needed David's music to comfort him. But he still has that knowledge of an experience of seeing God at work, that and knowing true prophets of God like Samuel. He should know better. He should know that it doesn't matter to God what your experience level is, but he still makes this incorrect assumption, and he tells David, you can't go out there because you're inexperienced. And so that's the assumption made at the government level. And it's not just Saul, it's all those also who were with him. And keeping in mind the fact that David's brothers, they were also part of the army. They were also part of that force that was gathered on that side, opposed to the Philistines. And so they all made that assumption about David. They were all scoffing and had disdain for David because of his willingness to go out there and to confront the Philistine. And we already saw, or rather, if you go back to chapter 16, the incorrect assumption by Saul there is also the incorrect assumption made by the people as well. And that's the kind of the third sphere of incorrect assumptions made is, they assumed that Saul was the king still when that transition had already taken place. In chapter 16, in verse 1, it says there, "The Lord said to Samuel, 'How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send to you Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons.'" And so Saul, had not completely transitioned his mind into thinking that, that he was no longer king. But neither did Samuel in entirety. That even though he anointed him, that transition had not completely taken place, and the people also were not really aware of this fact. They would be after this, but they had, they were witnessing a transition there occur, and they were not fully cognizant of that. God had already moved on, and large part because Saul was never really God's choice in terms of having his full heart invested in Saul. Saul was always designed by God to be a temporary king, a man of that time, in order basically to serve as a negative example. And this is all, this is also representative of human history, where God has given 6,000 years or so of human history for human rulers to rule, for the various, powers of this world, of, the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, up until this time period, the British and the Americans, whoever you want to say is in control of most of the world. God's given all this time to show just how incompetent and how evil and how temperamental and how terrible human leadership is. And Saul was another example of that, where the people demanded for a king. Further back in the same book, in 1 Samuel chapter 10, verses 17 through 19, we see there that Samuel calls the people together. God says, "I brought Israel up out of Egypt, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But today you have rejected your God, who saved you from all your calamities and your distresses, and you have said to him, 'Set a king over us.' Now, therefore, present yourselves before the Lord your tribes and by your households." And by your thousands. And so the assumption that the people had made was that the incorrect assumption that the people had made was that a human king, one like the rest of the world, they all had their kings and their rulers. Today we would say the world has their presidents and their prime ministers, and there are a couple kings here left, in different countries or whatever, mostly figureheads. But they put faith in kings, in earthly rulers. Israel was supposed to put their faith in God, the heavenly king, the true king over all things. But they betrayed that trust or that faith. They forsook the God who had delivered them out of Egypt and delivered them through the wilderness. They forgot all that heritage and all that God had done for them, and they said, we want a king like everybody else. And so God said, okay, I'll give you a king. I'll give you one who looks the part, someone who's, the common expression that we always remember is that he's head and shoulders, taller. He was head and shoulders above everybody else. He stood out in a crowd because he was tall, he was good looking. He had all the right look to him to be a king. Just like a politician today might, people might latch on to certain politicians because they just look the part or they sound the part. And so they wanted a human leader like that, and God gave it to them for a time period. But that was never his, true choice for king, because, and we saw with Saul, and we see later on that he got jealous of David. He went slowly into fits of rage and psychosis because of that demonic force acting on him, and the fact that the Spirit of God was no longer with him. And so that was the result of the people's assumption, that the human ruler would be better. It was not. It resulted in these the failures that started off with prior to this. It started, it was evident in the way things were going, but the Philistines showing up at their doorstep and presenting this confrontation was really the death knell for Saul. After that, the power shift started to occur, and God's candidate, as it were, showed up. And so lastly, the last sphere of incorrect assumptions that we're looking at, and I don't have time to really do this justice, but this is all things we're familiar with, but is the assumptions made by the Philistines. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, in our main passage, in verses 4 through 8, we see there a description of Goliath, and what we see there is Goliath's challenge there. We see the description of him basically, it talks about the fact that he's 6 cubits in a span in height. That's about 9'9" I've seen from the Egyptian cubit measurement, which is the measurement from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. And so you see various descriptions of or calculations, but it doesn't really matter. Basically, he was very tall, even by modern standards. He was very tall. He was what we would consider to be a giant, and he had 5,000 shekels of bronze. That's about 5,000 shekels of bronze as armor. That's about 125 pounds of armor, which is, again, very heavy, even by modern standards. A modern soldier might have, 45 pounds to 60 pounds on the extreme of equipment. That's not even, like talking about active, gear that they're using when engaged in a firefight or whatever. That's just the stuff they're carrying around. But this guy, Goliath, is using, carrying just an enormous amount of armor on his body. And in addition to that, his weapon, his main weapon, his spear, his javelin, the point of that alone weighed 15 pounds. That's if you ever just like look up a 15-pound dumbbell. I mean, that's not heavy to lift up. If you're just exercising, that's not heavy to pick up. But to put that on the edge of a spear or javelin that itself is long, in order to have that balance and to carry that around, and in order to throw it at some distance, to use it as an actual javelin, and not just as a spear thrusting. Even just to balance that is tricky, but to actually use it with full mobility, that gives you some idea that Goliath wasn't just some tall, skinny guy, who was too frail to move around. He was carrying really heavy armor, and being able to carry this weapon. So by any measure, any metric, people would have assumed, and they did assume, that Goliath was this undefeatable foe, that it was foolish, completely foolish. It was ridiculous to challenge him to a one-on-one battle. Even with somebody who was experienced in combat, some big burly guy with battle scars, they would have assumed that was foolish to challenge him, let alone this kid. What we see in verses 41 through 44, we see the description of David in comparison to Goliath. It says there, verse 41, the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And so by comparison, we see that David, it says there that he's a youth. So, Goliath looked down on him for his age. He assumed that his age, he couldn't possibly have experience, just like Saul made that assumption. It says there that he was ruddy. It might depend on different translations how that's translated. In King James and New King James and ESV and some other versions, it does say ruddy, which probably means that he was red-haired. I've seen other explanations that suggest that possibly it could mean that that his skin complexion or tone was such that he easily flushed in appearance or blushed, and it would make his skin red or whatever. Esau is also described as being ruddy, and I think it very likely, and this is the most logical, I think, explanation. It means that he was a redhead, that he had red hair. Same thing for Esau, and Esau, it would have been even more apparent because he was also very hairy, right? Hairy all over, and so that's how you get the nickname Red, or commenting on the fact that he was a redhead. And I assume, like today, because if you look at some people's modern or even in ancient times, Jewish people, Semitic peoples, light-skinned Caucasians, red hair is not very common among most of those people groups. Occasionally, we know some groups might have it more common, but it's still very rare. And so it was likely something that just like today, on playgrounds or even in, among politicians and among adults, if you have something that makes you look a little bit different, even if it's not something, that's necessarily a negative per se, people will make fun of that, right? So even today, people come up with derogatory terms like ginger, or, they might make fun of people for having red or orange hair, So we see that David, because he's young, he's got red hair, which even if they didn't see as a negative thing, it definitely set him apart, because most of those people would have dark hair, same as today. And also it says that he was handsome in appearance. So normally we think the opposite thing. We think that being handsome is an advantage, being attractive is an advantage, and in many contexts it is. But if you're somebody who's showing up to battle, people might assume the wrong thing about you if you're young and handsome. And, even today, if you're a soldier, you're looking for the big burly guy with scars, who might even look, have a frightening appearance, in the ugly, in, being very ugly. You might underestimate somebody if they look like a young pop star, right? If some Ed Sheeran look like, as David might have been. And so this Goliath is already disdaining him. He's looking down on him. And he's focusing on his appearance, but he's also focusing on the equipment, right? He's saying, he says to him, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And so he looks at, David. David doesn't have the armor on because he tried to appease or make Saul feel by trying on the armor and the weapons that Saul gave to him. And he tried to put it on, and he was like, "No, I can't do this. I'm not used to this armor. It's people know even today, if you're not used to the equipment, if same thing with like a car or a truck or other heavy equipment, forklift or whatever, or if you're in battle, if you're given armor or a gun that you don't know how to use properly, that you don't know how to take apart and all that, you're not going to be comfortable using it." And so David's rejected all of that. He just had a sling, a stone, and that was it. He did not have all these other accoutrements of battle. And so the assumptions that are incorrect here was the assumptions made about David's appearance, about his age or lack of experience, the assumption about David's equipment. He assumed that all the other soldiers on the field, including himself, he assumed that if you're a soldier, you have to have the equipment, you have to have the armor. Even though Goliath had armor on, and he had all this gear, he also had his own shield bearer. He had somebody also to carry a shield for him, and David was showing up just like that. And so the next assumption that, and this really characterizes not only the Philistines but the entire world as a whole, is the assumption that that his God, that the Philistine God or the Philistine gods, were going to be giving him the victory. It says there, and the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine, verse 44, said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." And so that assumption, that last assumption, that incorrect assumption made, is that that he would gain victory, that the Philistines would gain victory, that Goliath would gain victory because the victory belonged to him and his gods. And that was the fatal assumption, but it was informed by all these other assumptions that size wins battles, that tactics and armor matter more, that that the people of Israel were servants of man and not servants of God. That they were servants of some minor gods, who were not real gods, or like the Philistines. And so all these different assumptions were incorrect, whether it was by David's family, by the people, by the military, or by King Saul, or by the Philistines and the world at large. They were all assuming that that there was something to be had in size advantage, or in equipment advantage, or experience. And the truth is that none of these are advantages if you don't have God. And so the counter point, or the way to counter incorrect assumptions, is to have sound knowledge. That's the opposite of assuming, is to actually know something, to know something is true, and to know it's from God. And so that's the answer to incorrect assumptions. And so what we know is that we know that the world and its assumptions are often wrong, just like it was with Goliath and the Philistines. We know what our role is in this world. We know our God, and we know that he has plans for his people, for his kingdom, and for us specifically as individuals, and that God is the one that will equip us. In Zechariah chapter 4, verse 6, it says, "Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord Almighty." In 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 15, it says, "Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army, for the battle is not yours, but God's." So we don't know what is coming up in our future. We don't know what the future has to hold for us. We don't know what battles we'll see, whether it's physical battles like Old Testament times, or in modern conflict, or whether it's financial or interpersonal battles, or physical, all sorts of infirmities, or other challenges we might have. We might not be fighting literal giants or any of these other things, but we're going to see adversaries in the same sense that David saw. It's opposition from our own family members, or from our own government, or from the people that are around us, or even actual enemies, right? We don't know where the opposition will come from, but if we're holding to God's will, if we trust that God has a plan for us, if we're like David, we trust that he's the one who's going to provide the equipment that we need, and no more or less than what we need, that he's the one who gives us the stone to fight off the lion or the giant. If we trust in that, and if we do God's will, if we put our trust in him, then he's going to be the one to slay the giants for us. So let us be prepared for the upcoming battles in our life, spiritual warfare, and let's pray and thank God for the time he's given us in his word. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that we spent in your word, looking at David, briefly at his experience, how you set the stage for him to be king. Oh Lord, we know that he was, even though he was flawed, he was your choice to be king, O Lord. And because he trusted in you, that's why he was able to defeat the Goliath. Lord, give us the strength to do your will, to Tell the world about who you are, Lord. These gods of this world are nothing, that they do not exist, that they are meaningless, that you are the only true God, O Lord. Give us the strength and guide us in all that we do, O Lord. We pray all these things in Jesus' most precious name.